ख़वातीन व हज़रात, खुशामदीद। आगे की सीटें खाली हैं तो आगे आ जाएं आप लोग तो ज़्यादा अच्छा है। आइए ज़ोया साहब, आइए आगे आइए। जी जी आइए अशोक जी, आगे आइए। जनाब शमसुर रहमान फ़ारूक़ी यादगारी खुतबे में आप सबका तहे दिल से खैर मक़दम है। ये हम अमूमन उनकी सालगिरह के आसपास रखते हैं, 30 सितंबर के आसपास, लेकिन इस साल बवजूद उसको हमें थोड़ा पोस्टपोन करना पड़ा। तो मैं आज के स्पीकर और आज के चेयर को बुलाने से पहले 2-3 बातें। फ़ारूक़ी साहब इलाहाबाद के हैं और आलोक इलाहाबाद के हैं और इलाहाबाद के ही रहेंगे जैसा इन्होंने कहा है। और मैंने बचपन में एक इलाहाबाद में गोपाल दास नीरज की एक कविता पढ़ी थी जिसके 2 बोल मुझे याद रह गए हैं। हाय इलाहाबाद जहाँ सज्जन जन बसते, लेखक और अमरूद जहाँ दोनों ही सस्ते। मगर इलाहाबाद के बारे में एक बहुत उम्दा शेर फ़ारूक़ी साहब ने ख़ुद पढ़ा था। वतनी यहाँ हैं, राजीव ने जब उनको बुलाया था CSDS के 50वें साल पर, तो नासिख का एक शेर पढ़ा था उन्होंने। 3 तिरबेनी है 2 आँखें मेरी, तिरबेनी 3 है और 2 आँखें मेरी। 3 तिरबेनी है 2 आँखें मेरी, अब इलाहाबाद भी पंजाब है। यानी 5 जो है वो नदियाँ बह रही हैं, अब इलाहाबाद भी पंजाब है। तो फ़ारूक़ी साहब के आखिरी दिनों में उन्होंने बहुत 2-3, मुझे फ़ारसी नहीं आती लेकिन उनके साथ बैठ के 2-3 शेर मैंने याद किए थे, बहुत उम्दा। तो ज़माने के जिस दौर से हम गुज़र रहे हैं उस दौर के बारे में एक बहुत उम्दा शेर उन्होंने मुझे सुनाया था। उस्तखा हाय सालिका नुगज़ाश्त, उस्तखा हाय सालिका नुगज़ाश्त, रहरवा रा बराह बर मोहताज। यानी जो हड्डियाँ पड़ी हुई हैं सालिकों की, साधकों की, जो हड्डियाँ पड़ी हुई हैं, उन हड्डियों ने हम रास्ता चलने वालों को किसी राहबर की मोहताजी से आज़ाद कर दिया है। यानी जिस रास्ते पे हम चल रहे हैं उस रास्ते पे चलने वालों के सिर्फ अवशेष बचते हैं, उनकी सिर्फ हड्डियां यहाँ रह जाती हैं। इस रास्ते पे चलने वाला जो भी चलेगा वो मंजिल को पहुँचेगा नहीं पहुँचेगा ये नहीं मालूम, लेकिन सालिक की राह यही है कि वो अपने पीछे गए लोगों का जो भी उनका हाल हुआ है उस इब्तिलाए हाल के बावजूद वो अपने रास्ते पे चलता जाए। और मेरा ख़्याल है हमारे अहद के जो बहुत से लोग हैं जो यही काम कर रहे हैं, उनमें से बहुत से लोग यहाँ आज मौजूद हैं। ये बहुत खुशी की बात है। फ़ारूक़ी साहब की एक गज़ल के कुछ अशार सुना के फिर मैं आपको मदो करूँगा। इधर से देखें तो अपना मकान लगता है, इधर से देखें तो अपना मकान लगता है, एक और ज़ाविये से आसमान लगता है। जो तुम हो पास तो कहता है मुझको चीर के फेंक, जो तुम हो पास तो कहता है मुझको चीर के फेंक, वो दिल जो वक्त दुआ बेज़ुबान लगता है, वो दिल जो वक्त दुआ बेज़ुबान लगता है। शुरूए इश्क में सब जुल्फ़, हाँ बहुत उम्दा, क्या बात है, बहुत उम्दा। पढ़िए पढ़िए, आप पढ़िए, आपको फ़ारूक़ी साहब की गज़ल याद है? अच्छा, बहुत उम्दा। नहीं, बहुत अच्छी बात है भाई। इनका मतलब वो सरकने लगती है तभी कदम तले से ज़मीन, सरकने लगती है तभी कदम तले से ज़मीन, जब अपने हाथ में सारा जहान लगता है, जब अपने हाथ में सारा जहान लगता है। 2-4 घाटियाँ, एक दश्त, कुछ नदी नाले, बस इसके बाद हमारा मकान लगता है। तो फ़ारूक़ी साहब का तारुफ़ कराने की जसारत मुझे करने की ज़रूरत नहीं है मेरा ख़्याल है। और आलोक राय साहब जो हमारा आज कलीदी खुतबा देंगे, ख़ुद इलाहाबाद से ताल्लुक़ रखते हैं, इलाहाबाद में पले बढ़े, फिर दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी में आए। दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी में आने के पहले सीधे शायद इलाहाबाद से ऑक्सफ़ोर्ड चले गए थे रोड स्कॉलरशिप पे, फिर वहाँ से यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ लंदन में गए, ऑरवेल पे इनकी PhD है, फिर इन्होंने आईआईटी में पढ़ाया, दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी में पढ़ाया, यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ पेंसिल्वेनिया में पढ़ाया, और इनके मज़ामीन, इनकी तहरीरें और इनका जो वजूद है जहाँ पे ये खड़े हैं उसको देख के हम सब लोग बड़े हुए हैं। हमारे लिए तहरीक है और हमारे लिए मशअल राह हैं। और एक साथ इलाहाबाद और पेंसिल्वेनिया और कोलंबिया और ऑक्सफोर्ड में एकदम बराबर से खड़े होने वाले हमारे मुल्क में चंदे मादूदे लोगों में से एक हैं। तो मैं दावत देता हूँ आलोक राय साहब को, और अशोक वाजपेयी जी यहाँ हैं हर साल की तरह। मैं उनको ऑडियंस में बैठने का सुख नहीं दूंगा, वो आके इस खुतबे की सदारत करेंगे। मुझे बहुत अफसोस है दरअसल, ये जो मैं फरीज़ा, ये 12 फारूकी साहिबा जो उनकी दुख्तर नेक अख्तर हैं वो अंजाम देती हैं, लेकिन वो फंसी हुई हैं, वो नहीं आ पाई। तज़मीन उनकी लाडली नवासी यहाँ मौजूद हैं, अभी तक तो थी, बहुत 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 उनकी नुमाइंदगी कर रही हैं। तो अब मैं बग़ैर किसी ज़्यादा तमहीद के आलोक को दावत दूंगा, वो अपने बिल्कुल बैठ के बोलिए, बिल्कुल कलमात से नवाजेंगे।
Optional pasts, possible futures. I was very pleased with my title. I hope I'm able to rise to the challenge of that title. I'm grateful to the absent Faruqi sisters, Meher Afshah and Bara, and indeed to their irresistible persuader, Mahmood, for doing me the honor of inviting me to deliver the Shamsur Rahman Faruqi Memorial Lecture for this year. Faruqi Sahab was a dearly beloved friend and neighbor. We shared much our interest in language, all language really, but also of gardens and dogs, and particularly during the enforced solitude of the COVID years, our choice of objects to vent against, which was a very, very crucial aspect. But a memorial lecture is a different kind of thing altogether, and Faruqi Sahab's formidable scholarly stature becomes more than a little daunting. Still, in my defense, I plead affection and respect. I'm doing this in all modesty, only to make my homage to a part of the record. Faruqi Sahab and I were both, albeit at somewhat different times, graduates of the same English department at Allahabad University. And despite the bureaucratic distraction of his professional career, he made himself one of the most eminent scholars of Urdu's literary traditions and linguistic history of his generation, and perhaps of any generation, really. It was an inestimable privilege to be able to turn to him for clarification and more. I have a treasured memory of sitting down with him, at his feet really, if only metaphorically, along with the recently deported Francesca Orsini and my cousin Sara, and being guided through the multiple layers and nuances of a ghazal by Ghalib or Mir. So, in a word, he is much missed by me, along with a million others. My own point of entry, or quasi-scholarly entry into linguistic matters, is altogether more polemical, even political. I'm interested in the politics of language, in the ways in which politics structures, forges and deforms language, but also in which the ways in which language in turn structures politics, which happens both at an intimate lexical level and a phrasal level. And I made a quick note to myself about 3 words that are doing a lot of work in today's dispensation, but they would each require an essay to really attend to the work that they are doing. The words that I have right here are module, which is a very dangerous thing. Though I'm not quite sure where the danger derives from, because it's somewhere near nodule or something, because a module is more than a group. It is something very dangerous. Similarly, toolkit. Now, I have a toolkit, a perfectly ordinary toolkit, which has screwdrivers and things. But a toolkit is a dangerous thing. Similarly, decolonization. Now, it means all kinds of things. I used to think I knew, but now I don't. So, however, I'm interested also in the ways in which languages, and in the case of Urdu and Hindi, and also Konkani, actually, to my great surprise, even scripts become the axes of deeply consequential identity politics, implicating larger demographics and continental geographies. So, due warning, my interest in linguistic matters is rather far removed from the scholarly and deeply sophisticated world of Shamsur Rahman Faruqi. But with that warning in place, let me begin. Not so long ago, I was invited to reflect and write something on the ambiguous situation of Urdu in India. Indeed, in New India. For various reasons, this, which I wrote, could not be published in India and may indeed never be. So, I will present here, mutatis mutandis, the substance of that argument, and proceed to make some extrapolations and speculations which, to my mind, have a bearing on our possible and possibly imminent futures. My point of entry is at one level brutally simple. It involves a few vandals, groups of lumpen urban youth, moving around with pots of paint and defacing any signs in Urdu on street names and shop fronts, disfiguring anything written in the Urdu script. Now, this obviously is a very important act. I was reminded of Fitzgerald's Victorian Khayyam, where he wrote about the moving finger writes and having writ moves on, or all thy piety, no wit. Nothing, you cannot change what is written. Little did he know, you can change it all the time. You can change it with pots of paint. New histories are born very easily in this strange world. The offending script, as it happens, was the graceful Nastaliq script that comes from Persia. And to my mind is distinct from the Nas script, which I don't like quite as much, but I'm told that I am prejudiced, which I probably am. So, all it takes is paint and Urdu is gone. However, as with many other stories that have to do with the subcontinent, this one too soon ramifies and acquires an Old Testament quality, replete with begats. So A begat B, begat C, begat D, and ultimately there are begetters and begotten, but inevitably misbegotten as well. So in this Old Testament story, there are the misbegotten all the way back to some garden that is both lost, which is also known as Hindi. Now, there is a wholly unnecessary mystery surrounding the name Urdu, and there's an etymological, Faruqi Sahab has written about it, as a matter of fact. There's an etymological connection with the Turkish word for horde, army, and this is drawn upon to suggest that army encampments required people to communicate with each other from different regions and so on. And then the further argument is that the name Urdu is merely the abbreviated form of the Zaban-e-Urdu-e Mualla, which is to say the language of the Red Fort, which was, of course, a military facility along with being the royal palace. Here, immured in luxury, the last helpless inheritors of the Mughal dynasty were living out their historical extinction. And in this period of decline, they flattered themselves that their language is what conferred distinction upon them. Therefore, Urdu was to be distinguished from the language that ordinary people speak, And I have a nice quotation from, I'll just find it, excuse me. Yes, from Sayyid Muhammad Ahmad Dehelvi, who says that Urdu, by what he means by Urdu is, ना उस आज़ादाना उर्दू ही को पसंद करते हैं जो हिंदुस्तान के ईसाइयों, नौ मुस्लिम भाइयों, ताज़ा विलायत साहब लोगों, खानसामाओं, खिदमतगारों, पूरब के मनहियों ने अख्तियार कर रखी है. So the language that these ordinary people speak was to be distinguished from this distinctive language. And this ordinary people's language, so there was Urdu, which the distinguished people spoke, and Purdu. However, the fact of the matter is that there must have been a language that ordinary people were using, the Purab ke Manahis, etc., for it to be derided by these people who were seeking distinction in an increasingly arcane dialect, and which they sought to restrict only to a certain class of people who lived within the immediate vicinity of the Red Fort. Anyone beyond that was outside the pale. However, the matter of linguistic origins here as elsewhere is shrouded in obscurity, and all that we know is that 1,000 or so years ago, the vernacular languages that are identified as early forms of India's many modern languages began to emerge from some pre-modern linguistic mix of diverse Prakrits, i.e. natural languages, and Sanskrit, which, as the name suggests, is a refined form of something. By definition, Sanskrit has to be sanskarit, something that has been made from something, also I believe. Still, this need not detain us now. The likely process, despite the various claims that ideologues may make in favor of one strand or other of dyslexical mix, a sort of middle language emerged through and to service the communication needs of a large mobile population that consisted of monks, merchants, mendicants, refugees, adventurers. And I wonder if Peggy Mohan is here, perhaps not. But Peggy Mohan has a book which she brought out recently called Wanderers, Kings, Merchants, The Story of India Through Its Languages. Much recommended to those who haven't read it already. While the overarching administrative vocabulary that evolved was Persian, the popular vernacular that emerged had many, many local variations. These are what over the centuries become full-fledged languages, while the others are sometimes considered mere dialects. These local variations too had both high and low registers, but all that we need to identify here from our purposes is the emergence and persistence of a middle language that emerged on a maddeningly slippery grammatical base that, I am assured, derives from neither of the two contending ideological claimants. It is neither Persian nor Sanskrit. And this middle language, with its diverse local registers, served the vernacular purpose of contigual intelligibility, i.e. people could speak to people who were immediately near them. Fractious ideologues point out, rightly, that people who deploy distant local registers cannot understand each other, so that someone who speaks Rajasthani sounds very different from someone who speaks Bhojpuri. But it is also true that these various local registers fade into each other fluently, and migrants have access to a common substrate middle language, which is what came to be identified as the language of Hindustan, i.e. Hindustani. The present and near national currency of the language of Bombay cinema draws on precisely this cultural and civilizational experience. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, traveling across India in 1869, wrote, I quote, बंदा ने इलाहाबाद से बंबई तक क्या गांव में और क्या चौकियात में और क्या रेल में और क्या गवर्नमेंट के अहलकारों और हर महकमे के चपरासियों और हर एक जगह के कुलियों से उर्दू में गुफ्तगू की, सब लोग हर जगह बखूबी समझते थे और उर्दू ही में जवाब देते थे। बाज़ लफ्ज़ों के मुकर्रर समझने की और ज़्यादातर आसान तौर पर बयान करने की ज़रूरत पड़ती थी। कुछ शुबा नहीं कि तमाम हिंदुस्तान में उर्दू ज़बान इस तरह समझी और बोली जाती है। All I need to say is that Grierson, in his linguistic survey, described or named this common language in which one could communicate, Hindi. Literary Urdu, replete with lexical borrowings and also deploying sundry grammatical conveniences from Persian, like the miraculously versatile izafat, is still unmistakably another register constructed on the same grammatical foundation. And it is easy to see that Urdu, whether in its high vernacular, literary or low vernacular registers, whether as Urdu or Hindustani or even Hindi, has been produced by centuries of cosmopolitan communication needs. In communication interaction in one of the busiest parts of the pre-modern world, to express the creative and expressive urges of diverse people with very different linguistic lineages, mingling in the land that medieval travelers identified as Hind. So that, as we know very well, Hindi is merely the Persian genitive form of from Hind. I was amused to discover, to be told rather, I do not know this, that the Urdu genitive suffix is U, in which case of Hind would in Turkish, as a Turkish genitive, give you the form Hindu. So, a Hindu is basically, according to the Turks, anyone who lives in Hind. However, this language, I suggest, is the product of a hybridizing process that is practically without parallel in the pre-colonial world. It is by the same token a significant and practically unique civilizational achievement. One may remember Mir Taqi Mir's confident assertion, पढ़ते फिरेंगे गलियों में इन रेख्तों को मीर, मुद्दत रहेंगी याद, ये बातें हमारियाँ. Rekhta, by the way, in rekhton ko, rekhta itself means mixed and hybrid. It is, however, intrinsic to the nature of this achievement that it is also a civilizational record of a more or less harmonious or minimally only intermittently murderous coexistence of diverse peoples. It is also, therefore, not surprisingly the despair of tidy-minded grammarians and lexicographers, and of course offensive to purity-obsessed nativists, reaching back to some mythic Indian past, some mythic, in fact, Indian is not good enough, reaching back to some mythic Indic past. And I've always been puzzled by that Indic. But it's clearly, again, it's one of those terms which is doing some very important work. All I need to say here is that this is a longing for a time before. Yes. A reaching out for a time before time. Before history happened and its multiple contaminations. And this has assumed new forms, grotesque forms in New India. And again, the words that I do not have time to write a short essay on are Indic, the word Bharat, and indeed the larger process of Tatsamization, of the search for the Tatsam form, so that Varanasi for Banaras It took centuries for Varanasi to become Banaras. You take it back to Varanasi, and so on. Anyway, there are many. Gurugram is something I like very much. All right. So, anyway, if there is any truth in this broadly consensual and, I must apologize, entirely familiar narrative of linguistic evolution, then the present vehement hostility against Urdu, and particularly the Urdu script, and this, my argument hinges on script, sorry, should be something of a puzzle. However, the fact that this hostility is directed against the Urdu script in particular gives us a valuable historical clue, and following this, I believe one might gain some insight into the theoretical and historical underpinnings of the deeper politics of resentment, ressentiment, of victimhood, which drives the project of cultural recovery that is crucial to understanding the present dispensation. The fact that the history that they are seeking oddly to opt out of and so reverse and rectify with paint and amnesia is something of which one may rightly feel proud. And this has all been drowned in the cacophony of hate. Still, starting from this widely shared sense of victimhood and from the oddly significant role that the Urdu script plays in this. Remember, my starting point is the people who went around the streets of Delhi with pots of paint, painting over stuff. I invoke a relatively minor historical moment in 19th century North India, much studied. The names are well known: Christopher King, Francesca Orsini, Ustad Almia. I also have something on it. But in order to make sense of the exponential escalation of this relatively minor struggle in the 19th century, one has to step back a little and set it against the background of what is, in my view, the founding catastrophe of modern India. This is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, so please forgive me. The revolt of 1857, or the Sepoy Mutiny, as the British called it, or the preferred Savarkar nationalist form, which is the First War of Independence. But I always feel the need to balance the First War of Independence with another book that might be less familiar, called Majha Pravas by Vishnu Bhatt Godse, because that gives one a wonderfully farcical account of what the First War of Indian Independence actually looked like to these two indigent Pandits who had ventured north to Banaras because they'd heard that there was some munificent donor who was doling out stuff to Brahmins. And so they came. Unfortunately, long before they got to Banaras, they got caught up in these events. All right? And yeah. So, my particular interest is in the fact and significance, however, of the repression that followed the defeat of the mutineers. The memory of this repression and the rampant campaigns of bloodthirsty revenge that were carried on by the victorious British lives on in popular memory, in folklore and legend, in songs and in bardic recitals. So few Indians will fail to recognize the line "Bundele har bolon ke mukh, humne suni kahani thi," which is the line, by the way, I am, for good family reasons, proud to own. However, all it means is that clearly, even though the First War of Independence and so on was derided in official discourse and was called Balwa and various other dismissive terms, it lived on in popular memory. But the significance of this repression and the long-term consequences of this for the modern history of India, its politics and culture, for the deeply paradoxical embrace of the ensuing and colonially inflected modernity by different sections of Indian society, has not been given due attention. My argument is that basically the repression after 1857 reconfigures through traumatic violence North Indian society. Broadly speaking, 1857 marks a kind of abyss. It is the final defeat of old India. And again, I refer only in passing to Ralph Russell's famous essay, How Not to Write the History of Urdu Literature. And other people who studied it, Francis Pritchett, and not least Faruqi Sahab's own monumental labor of recovering the sense of that old India before it had got overlaid by a sense of shame, which is what is associated with the names of Hali and Azad. The long defeat that had been initiated, by the Mughal emperor signing over the financial control of his empire to Robert Clive after the Battle of Buxar in 1765, saw its final moment in 1857 when the sons of the last emperor, the poet Bahadur Shah Zafar, were beheaded. And the emperor himself, after having been shown the severed heads of his sons, was exiled to a solitary death in a prison cell in Burma, across the black waters of the Bay of Bengal. Zafar lives on. I need hardly tell this audience, this was needed for a different audience, in a couple of ghazals that he is supposed to have written while in prison, from which comes the line, Do ghaz zameen bhi na mili kuए yaar mein. All right, the do ghaz, that was all that was needed for his grave. But as a matter of detail that I find interesting, and it tells us something about New India, Bahadur Shah had actually, in the manner of Mughal kings, constructed a designate mausoleum for himself in Mehroli. On the night of the 10th December 2023, the unfilled grave of Bahadur Shah in Delhi was vandalized by persons unknown. And while his grave remained untenanted, so to speak, his unmarked burial place in Burma was grassed over by the victorious British. So, Do ghaz zameen bhi na mili, or the mausoleum itself, the designate grave, was vandalized. On the flip side of this poignancy, however, the larger process that we observe is that of a decimation of the pre-1857 elite and the emergence of a new elite. This is crucial to my argument. This produced a power vacuum, a social churning in the subcolonial level of North Indian society. Loyalty to the British was naturally rewarded, and by the same token, landlords who were disloyal were dispossessed and replaced. And there is the invaluable compilation of old-timers' memories by Amrit Nagar, Aankho Dekha Gadar, which I would recommend, and again, to people who are interested in this history. It was, in the perception of the British, it was the Muslim landowners who had been disproportionately rebellious. And this evidence for this is widely available, particularly in Ghalib's own letters. Thus, the late Mughal elite of North India was burdened with colonial suspicion. In addition to that, however, and more relevantly for our story, it had increasingly to confront a new proto-elite, and this is the crucial part, which was educated in the Nagari script that had been forming in a minor stream of the colonial education system. The present and puzzling hostility to the Urdu script has its origins in this relatively unregarded historical backwater. This process of contention between the late Mughal elite, which was identified as the Awadh elite, and the new proto-elite, which consisted predominantly of upper caste Hindus, Brahmins, Rajputs, and Banyas, the great defenders of the Sanatani order. This confrontation, in turn, in its evolved and evolving historical form, played a decisive role in the eventual defeat of the oft-remembered composite culture of the late Mughal elite of Awadh, which is now recalled with a mixture of panic and nostalgia as the country copes with the consequences of the victory of that restless proto-elite and its successors. These consequences, still evolving, are indeed a crucial factor in shaping India's present, and I fear its future too. But in order to understand how the matter of Urdu and script and then language and finally Islam itself is implicated in this vast historical process, I need to turn briefly to what has been referred to as I've written about this, so I'm a little apologetic. I just hope some of you are unfamiliar with this, otherwise I must apologize for repeating stuff you know already. The court character controversy, which climaxed with Malviya's memorandum in 1897. The story of this, and I need to abbreviate this very simply. This was quite simply that the post-1857 education dispensation created two educational streams, one of which was educated in the Urdu script and the other which was educated in the Nagari script. The Urdu script attracted the people, the classes, groups which became the Awadh elite, and the Nagari script had the ones who were excluded. By a bizarre 1877 order, having created these two streams of educated people, the government of NWP ruled that anyone who wanted employment in the government, which was the prime source of employment then, as now, had to be familiar with the Urdu script. That the people from the second Nagari-based stream were pointedly excluded from employment in all but the lowest reaches of the colonial administrative machine. Nothing, and this really, you got to take this in, nothing that offers more than 10 rupees annually. So if your competence was restricted to Nagari, you couldn't go beyond 10 rupees annual. This obvious anomaly predictably led to resentment and a gradually rising clamor for the acceptance of Nagari as an alternative script. This entirely reasonable demand was equally predictably opposed by the class of Urdu script-knowing people who had staffed the administration. So there's a vested interest and a new interest that is challenging it. The toxic potential of this necessarily escalating process of contention, going all the way from polite memoranda through province-wide signature campaigns to angry journalism and eventually electoral mobilizations and worse, cannot be understood without some attention to the class and, in India, caste composition of the contending groups. The ensconced and resistant elite, which wanted to preserve its privilege, was one that formed during the period of Mughal rule. And this ensconced elite was non-sectarian, steeped in the Persianate culture of administration and refinement that had evolved over the centuries. The reach of this culture extended over much of northern and peninsular India. It existed in an entire range of high and low registers from Mir through Ghalib to Nazir Akbarabadi, and ranged against this and demanding with increasing vociferousness their rightful share in the official power structure, there was the proto-elite, which was excluded not only from the administration but also from the urbane social world of Persianate refinement. Thus, and I don't need to, for this audience, I don't need to talk very much about this, but the whole importance that is attached to the proper articulation of the sheen and the kaf, and how that is something that was and indeed continues in some sense to be used as a marker of social refinement. Now, I must resist the temptation to romanticize this. I'm very inclined to do it myself, so I must resist this temptation. But the Australian historian D.A. Lowe, talking about this culture, also talked about it as a husk culture, that it really had no depth to it, that there was a kind of cosmetic meeting point, but that once it was challenged, and it was challenged, it crumbled. The challenger proto-elite, largely Brahmin, Rajput and Baniya, had traditionally, and before the advent of modernity and its associated evils, had dominated the worlds of intellect, feudal agriculture and commerce, respectively. And now they were, with increasing impatience, demanding their share of power, clamoring for their place in the sun. It is hardly surprising that the resultant contention and conflict was explosive and enduring. But the immediate, and this is crucial, the immediate and highly visible symbol of their comprehensive exclusion, both from the administrative machine and from their status at the top of the social pyramid, remember Sheen Kaf, was clearly the Urdu script. This script, flaunting its elegant Nastaliq variant, came to stand for the culture of refinement that had been produced by promiscuous centuries of cross-cultural hybridization. The cultural and political ramifications of the retrospective consolidation of an upper caste Hindu identity, Brahminical, purity-obsessed, harking back to some mythical time before the hybridizations, before the Sanatan or eternal order, the sacred Varnashram, tumbled into the chaos of Kalyug and the fallen present, are still, so to speak, a work in progress, and I could hardly resist translating the progress because, of course, we are talking about Vikas. These two contending elites were both, in their different ways, the Awadh elite and the challenger elite, were both forced to deal with challenges produced by modernity. And both elites, in turn, resorted to and evolved deeply consequential survival strategies. The traditional, feudal and largely Muslim elite of North India that was dominant in the colonial administration was forced to deal also with the newfangled idea of competitive examinations. This suggestion was made to me, by the way, by the late, and also much missed, much lamented Professor C.M. Naeem from Chicago. The traditional route to recruitment had been to a significant extent by way of familial entitlement. Replacements were made from dependents. It was the Ummidwari system. However, modernizing administrative reforms introduced the practice of competitive exams for recruitment. Not surprisingly, this administrative reform was bitterly resented by the traditional and largely Muslim elite, which rightly and vocally, I will read you something, saw themselves as endangered by, quote, educated Bengalis. Their survival strategy gave birth more or less instantly to the Muslim League, and in time to political Islam and arguably to Pakistan. However, that's as may be. This is a zero-sum game, and this is Sir Syed addressing the Muslim Educational Congress in Lucknow in 1887. In 1887. He denounced the Congress. This is while the Indian National Congress was meeting in Madras, Chennai, Madras, and however. He denounced the Congress as an attempt by, quote, frail-bodied Bengalis to take over India. Democracy and bureaucratic recruitment by merit, quote, please, merit, were impossible in a land that lacked a homogeneous political community. Such a system would only lead to temporary domination by inferior breeds of men. The proper representatives of Indian opinion in the councils of government should be men appointed on the basis of social position as determined by ancestry and not ability. He continued, would our aristocracy like that a man of low caste and insignificant origin, though he be a BA or MA, and have the requisite ability, should be in a position of authority over them and have the power in making the laws that affect their lives and property? Never. Nobody would like it. Cheers from the audience. Anyway, more and more, think of what the consequences would be if over all races, and not only over Mohammedans, but over Rajas of high position and the brave Rajputs who have not forgotten the swords of their ancestors, would be placed as ruler a Bengali, who at the sight of a table knife would crawl under his chair. Uproarious cheers and laughter. If you accept that the country should groan under the yoke of Bengali rule and its people like the Bengali shoes, I couldn't catch the reference there. What are these Bengali shoes? Maybe someone will tell me. Then in the name of God, jump into the train and sit down and be off to Madras. Off to Madras. Go to the Congress. This newly emergent Hindu Savarna elite was hungry and educated, albeit in the wrong kind of education, and was uniquely positioned to take advantage of this opportunity, but for the exclusionary impact of the script rule. It was the script rule that simply kept them out. On the other hand, while the Hindu Savarna proto-elite sought to which wanted Nagari, to take avail of the employment opportunities in an expanding and reforming bureaucracy, modernity as opportunity, it had to deal with different challenges emanating from the lower castes elsewhere. So also challenges emanating from modernity, but different challenges, which is ideas of equality, anti-hierarchy, and so on. This emergence of this lower caste challenge shows considerable variation across the country. And as we know, Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu are very advanced in this. And my heartland is, so to speak, the heartland of the Brahminical resistance to that lower caste challenge. But this challenge, with its regional flavors and variations, is one of the key triggers in what becomes the nominally trans-caste ideology of Hindutva that is driving the emergence of New India. The caste element in the making of modern Hindi requires a little bit of research to be brought to the fore, but that research has happened, and it is now there is a very clear consciousness that there is, take one very simple example. This is from Hindi Sahitya Sammelan presidential address from 1912, where I might be getting this slightly wrong, where the script controversy is referred to, because the most popular script at the time was Kaithi. And the name that is used for Nagari is, of course, Babni. Babni. That is the name of the script. Okay? Reference given. Okay. In thinking about Urdu's embattled status in India today, simultaneously delegitimized and embraced, one has to understand the phenomenon on at least two different levels. The first is simply at the level of language and culture, of poetry and performance. The second is at the bitterly political level, at which Urdu, first script and then language too, becomes somewhat oddly a symbol of Muslims and of Islam. This equation is prima facie silly. The majority of India's Muslims have no familiarity with the higher register of Urdu, while the lower register merges seamlessly into the non-sectarian vernacular which exists in many variations and under many names. Again, what Urdu does to Pakistan and the making of Bangladesh is a separate story. I won't go there. Even so, through an identifiable and relatively minor process, the Nagari controversy of the NWP, which I talked about, through this process, Urdu becomes identified with Muslims and Islam. This identity eventually mutates into a historically fanciful account of 1,000 years of slavery, which is the necessary foundation of the necessary victimhood of the Hindu Savarna. It is in this latter sense that the hostility to Urdu provides an insight into the formation of the ideology of Hindutva and into the real, if also relatively restricted experience of victimhood at its core. So my argument is that there is a real limited victimhood which gets magnified and gets used tactically later. The deceptively minor key to this entire toxic process is the identification of Urdu with Muslims and with Islam is obviously strange, because with literacy levels in NWP estimated to have been around 2%, the script controversy should have been of direct concern only to the literate elites which sought to find a place in the administration. However, as the contention escalated, it was given in the logic of the struggle itself that newer constituencies had to be mobilized. Newer arguments marshaled. Hindu drivers of the heartland who were driving the Nagari agitation progressively developed a Brahminical Hindu ideology in which the obvious foreignness of the Urdu script was easily located within the purity pollution matrix. This taboo extended as the contention grew and included not only foreign words that had become inextricably parts of vernacular usage, but also foreign sounds. So that in one somewhat farcical extension, the prejudice extended not only to the sounds, but also to the nuktas which identified the points, so that the Hindi mein bindi became an issue. Initially, the social group that was invested in the administrative monopoly of the Urdu script included both Muslims and Hindus. This is the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb and so on. The culture of the land between the two great rivers. But this composite culture of cross-sectarian coexistence, participating in each other's festivals, owing allegiance to a shared culture of Persianate refinement, sunlight on a broken column, so on, so forth. Lots of very romantic, nostalgic writing about that. Had little purchase with the broad and largely unlettered masses of the heartland, and became an entirely predictable casualty of the mobilizational compulsions of the two contending elites. So, basically with 2% literacy, there are elites, but the logic of the struggle demands that more and more people get mobilized. And in drawing more people, mobilizing them with signature campaigns and so on, requires recasting the demands in terms that go beyond mere literacy. It is important to understand that these two contending elites were themselves dynamic and evolving entities. They evolved in the logic of this struggle. Thus, while the ensconced Awadh elite was initially Persianate and non-sectarian, the formation and mobilization of the Muslim League in the defense of Urdu, which happened very early, put this initially non-sectarian character under radical stress. Similarly, the progressive Hinduization of the pro-Nagari faction also has to be seen as part of a dynamic mobilizational process. So it starts off as a demand for employment. However, the need to pursue that demand with a reluctant administration requires more and more mobilization, which leads to a different kind of politics. The elite group committed to the maintenance of the monopoly of the Urdu script continued to make appeals to the famous composite culture, but also increasingly turned to the largely illiterate Muslim masses, and who were persuaded to see Urdu as a symbol of Islam. There's a very good paper on this, by the way, by Ayesha Jalal and Anil Seal. The contradiction there is obvious, and when the defense of Urdu was taken up by the newly formed Muslim League, the resort to composite culture came to be seen more and more like hypocrisy. There is thus a deadly complementarity between the Muslim consolidation behind Urdu and the Brahminical Hindu consolidation behind Nagari. After all, while Urdu had little to do with the Arabic Quran, Nagari was in fact the script of the sacred Hindu scriptures. It was incidentally, and this pleases me very much, that it was through this process that the script which was merely Nagari, even in Malviya, becomes Devanagari, the script of the gods. So Nagari becomes Devanagari, so that you and I now routinely would say Devanagari and not Nagari. So summarizing, the current hostility towards Urdu must be seen in at least two aspects, seen as working through two linked but not identical processes. The first is the Islamicization of Urdu, initially script, and then in the process of contention, the language too. And second, the emergence of anti-Islamic prejudice in India, that's to say, way beyond NWP. My argument is that Urdu is both part of the causal matrix in which the present prejudice against Islam is formed in India, and a visible symbol of Islam, even when that prejudice is deployed tactically for other reasons, which have no relation to Urdu. But Urdu stands, again, as a symbol of something. Thus, the point of the first section was to look at the process through which the identification of Urdu script with Islam happens. The second sought to show how this resentment, which in the specific northwest province situation, located in the Hindu Savarna castes, translates into the anti-Muslim prejudice that is crucial to the formation and formulation of an upper caste, but also crucially trans-caste and so caste evasive Hindu identity. This is a sort of tricky argument, so let me try and get a grip on this. I believe that anti-Muslim prejudice is crucial to the formulation of what is commonly understood as Hindu nationalism. Thus, so basically Savarkar's Hindutva is anti-caste, supposedly. But the insight stemming from the Northwest Province Nagari agitation enables us to see that the Hindu Savarna resentment against Muslims has a real historical core. That real historical core relates to the social conditions produced by the employment thing of the 1877 order and the exclusion of a certain class of educated people from government employment. It is also important to see that the foundational category of Muslim is again crucial, highly flexible, and can accommodate everything as we move across India, from late Mughal princes and the feudal zamindari elites, as in Northwest Province, to the lower castes who had converted to Islam over the centuries to escape the humiliations intrinsic to the Brahminical caste order. It can also, by the same token, enable many different variants of Savarna Hindu politics. The subsumption of this diversity of Muslims in the overarching category of Islam has the implicit and retrospective but critical effect of subsuming and so obscuring the fractures intrinsic to a caste-based social order, and so enabling the overarching category of Hinduism. Thus, basically, it is possible the Muslim is sufficiently vague as a category for there to be a Muslim for all seasons, as it were. So, elite Muslims are resented as usurpers of the former status of the Savarna castes. Non-elite Pasmanda Muslims are resented as lower castes who have seceded from the Hindu Savarna castes. The Awadh zamindars are resented for being arrogant zamindars. The Bengal peasants are resented for being recalcitrant peasants. In Kerala, one hears grumbling about Gulf money and burqas in malls. While in UP and Bihar, they talk about dirty gutters and pancharwalas. This play of Hindu-Muslim contention plays out differently in different locations, but results eventually, as we know, in the spectacular and bloody non-resolution of the partition. But anyway, that I don't want to go there. Now, while it is relatively easy to erase the Urdu script, a little bit of paint, a little water clears us of this deed. The attempt to banish the Urdu language is rather more complex, because while one may abjure the higher registers of Urdu with their Perso-Arabic lexical borrowings, or indeed, as like the late Mughals, seek to restrict the name Urdu exclusively to those higher registers, the undeniable fact of the matter is that grammatically and syntactically and even lexically, the great vernacular of India, called Hindi, Hindustani, or Urdu, is a product of one unified process of cultural hybridization. To mark out this glorious and shared linguistic domain with arbitrary lines that may not be transgressed is quite simply unsustainable without doing violence primarily to oneself. This kind of violence can be observed in schools, in disciplinary institutions, and in officialese, where entire ranges of language are marked by a combination of resentment and longing. And lots of people have written about this. Everybody has a favorite example of their preferred variant of this kind of Hindi. There's the Laupat Gamini, etc., which is, it's easy to laugh at that, all right? I was recently talking to a computer scientist who was asked to translate, and he said, what would he do with microprocessor? And I will read it simply because it's easy to laugh at it, but I think my point is simply not to treat it farcically. This is, by the way, Laghu Prakriyopkaran. Laghu Prakriyopkaran. Laghu Prakriya Upkaran. Sandhi. All right. Now, anyway, the point is not to treat it as farce. It is farce. But my interest through this, my argument concerns the pathology that informs this farce, the pathology that underlies this farce. What exactly is going on in producing such absurdity? To mark out this glorious and shared linguistic domain with arbitrary lines is unsustainable without doing violence, as I said, and obviously it can be spoken. It has been written about. Krishna Kumar in The Political Agenda of Education has written about it. All right. It is customary to speak of language in the idiom of loss. Thus, language never is, it always was. This elegiac tendency is particularly marked in the case of Urdu. It is perpetually alleged to be a dying. आशिक का जनाजा है, जरा धूम से निकले. The fact is that Urdu is a vibrant part of a political culture and public life of this country. If one sets the paint-bearing louts and against the milling crowds at the recently concluded Jashn-e-Rekhta, one realizes that the matter of Urdu in India is rather more complex. Now, I don't need to tell, this was for the New York audience, they needed to be told what Jashn-e-Rekhta was. I hardly need to spell this out here. Thus, along with the hostility and the symbolic violence wreaked periodically on signs of Urdu, there is an unmistakable cultural current of longing for it. So that in a kind of exchange that I was having with Peggy Mohan about this, she spoke about an interesting phrase. She described it as a kind of curdled love. So it's a love for Urdu, but that love has curdled. बुरी शायरी बहुत है, क्या बताएं. Clearly, this is not the place. This longing for Urdu coexists with the desire to banish it. And it is this tension, this irreducible paradox goes to the heart of what it means to be an Indian in India today. Crucified on an impossible nationalism that demands at different levels a delegitimation and an amputation of something that is in fact an organic part of ourselves. That you can join the party, हाथ काट के आइएगा, आइए जरूर, एक टांग कम, etc. Clearly, this is neither the place nor the occasion, and nor indeed am I the person to offer a full linguist's account of the making of Urdu and its many excellences. But this longing needs to be unpacked a little. What one needs to ask is this longing a longing for? What is the cultural space? What are the zones of nuance and refinement that Urdu opens up or minimally provides glimpses of? It is a well-observed fact that irrespective of linguistic or regional affiliation, whenever people from a vast swathe of South Asia reach out for some pithy, resonant formulation, some telling expression to round out an oration, to underline some significant utterance, they reach out for some fragment of the Urdu archive. Even the mild-mannered Manmohan Singh, rounding off his famous liberalization speech in the Indian Parliament in 1991, brought up an oddly inappropriate Urdu couplet. He first said, I will go, so, it's interesting. He first declared that, kind of big thing done, I will go, let my assassins be informed, I will go to the theater tonight. Reference, Abraham Lincoln. I will go to the theater tonight. Thereafter, he said, सरफरोशी की तमन्ना अब हमारे दिल में है, देखना है जोर कितना बाजुए कातिल में है. We don't need to be told how utterly inappropriate this is for the great Dr. Manmohan Singh. But there it is. The poet flamboyantly asserts his desire for martyrdom. The quotability of Urdu may be thought of at two different levels. The first has to do with the fluency that is indexed as a particular virtue in the Urdu critical vocabulary, thus Ravani. Once again, this is obviously a consequence of the way in which language has evolved through the rubbing together of diverse peoples with diverse linguistic repertoires thrown together in the multicultural river. But over and above this simple millennia-old process, shaped by the communicative and expressive needs of diverse peoples, there is also the explicit discipline of Urdu language education, which pays particular attention to the matter of syllabic accents and rhythmic utterance. This is, of course, particularly important in the context of Urdu literary production. The classical rigor, the tight metrical forms, the sinuous tonalities legitimized by tradition all add up to a formidable linguistic training. But something of this training rubs off even on the lay language user, who has at least some exposure to Urdu. The only ones who fall outside this vast circle are the unfortunate victims who are exposed or ideologically restricted to sterile Brahminical language, pure and austere, and are condemned forever to long for Urdu with that famous curdled love. In the interests of fairness, particularly in today's charged context, it is important to note that there is a parallel purist tendency in Urdu education as well, which sacrifices the hybrid fluency of the Indian-born Urdu in favor of the guttural echoes of Quranic Arabic. The consequential emotional state does not concern us now. But I must mention, since I've mentioned Professor Naeem, that he talked about, he referred to my own work on the pathology that produces purity-obsessed Hindi, and he spoke about the pathology that produces purity-obsessed Urdu, and said that that work still remains to be done, that work also needs to be done, and it has not been done. Eloquence is ultimately a mysterious phenomenon, but I believe that in us language-embedded creatures, blundering through a confusion of rubbed-down words and expressions, cliches and stock phrases, there is still, and perhaps therefore, a hunger for eloquence, for resonance. Language is a prime casualty of school systems worldwide. But the remarkable thing is that even in our linguistically deprived time, it seems as if the need for eloquence has not abated. On momentous occasions, people still strive to raise their language above the ruck of the mundane. It is in this context that Urdu continues to play a highly significant cultural function. Thus, people resort to Urdu, complete with the Persian izafat, rather in the manner in which they resort to Sanskrit, as if the mere sound of the language, even when the sense is not comprehended, the sound of the language, as in a mantra, will somehow compensate for banality. But I suspect that there is a serious point here which I can only index. And this is where I would gladly have liked Mahmood to talk about this at greater length. Maybe he will. The subtlety and nuance of Urdu, its ability to transfigure mundane expression with a sudden aesthetic dimension, is the work of centuries. The dialogic character of the Urdu mushaira has been remarked upon, the enthusiastic way in which the poet and his audience participate in the joint creation of the poetic experience. And this is obviously upsetting to people who are used to more sedate situations in which audiences keep quiet and clap when they're asked to. So that when Mahmood does his Dastangoi, he encourages his audience to actually do a wah-wah once in a while, instead of clapping, which generally means get away. However, Just a second. So this participation, which might well seem alien within more sedate traditions, is crucial to the way in which the language has developed and entered a space, a shared space. The play of the Khafia and the Radif of the Urdu ghazal ensure that the poet must remain close to everyday language in the repeated words and sounds, and still graft them onto new and unfamiliar contexts in order to generate new and unexpected nuances. One retrospective and extra poetic effect of this technical imperative, and I would like to hear more from others, is that ordinary idioms and verb phrases are endowed with nuanced cultural associations, and everyday language acquires a kind of dense metaphoricity, a semantic buzz. I'm making notes to myself, and I said, that I wrote down muddat, and muddat immediately calls to mind muddat hui hai yaar ko, and so instantly, as it were, an ordinary word muddat se nahi mile hain, suddenly acquires resonance. Ye sham bhi kahan hui, and so on. So perfectly ordinary words. What is being identified here is not some elite phenomenon in which one participates by virtue of education or other privilege. One partakes of the world of Urdu poetry, and indeed I would suggest bhakti, merely by possessing and being possessed by a deep, everyday, lived culture. And Francis Pritchett, in a lovely paragraph, suggests that this might be accessible even across cultural divides. Thus, she recounts the way in which Begum Akhtar's rendering of some ghazals, and these are her words, dense, tight, intricate structures made of beauty and energy held in perfect balance, resonated so well with my inner life and my own sense of poetry that I loved them even before I understood them. This is the kind of, what I'm trying to capture is this, the way in which refined language and everyday language achieve a kind of intimacy. I suspect that Fran Pritchett is merely being modest, by the way. But this observation might be rather more true of the milling crowds at the Rekhta festival, right? Where they are happy to join simply because it comes right, it sounds right, it's right in the way in which the sum in music comes right. You want to join it because it is what should happen at that point. However, beyond the matter of the rhythmic, fluent utterance that Urdu indexes, there is another deeper and, to my mind, trickier reason for the sheer attractiveness of Urdu, its undeniable cultural presence. To a significant extent, the sentimental education of the people of this country happens through exposure to the great epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, with their many ancillary texts and narratives. But beyond the great epics, the other great cultural fount where people learn how to live and to love is the Urdu archive, both in the classics but also in the popular music of Bombay cinema. The great archive of popular song is an under-researched phenomenon, but no one who is familiar with the contexts in which Indians gather can have failed to notice how deeply Indian people are invested in that archive of popular music at the level of memories and of their emotional lives generally. Disjunct from the particular contexts in which they first emerged, these songs, in fluent, popular Urdu, are the language in which vast numbers of people live their emotional lives. This is where they learn the meanings of love doesn't get talked about in families. Where they learn is in good and indeed in bad shairi. To come back to curdled love. Finally, then, I will content myself with saying only this. Urdu, in all its registers, from the demotic vivacity of popular speech to the lovingly evolved traditions of the higher literary registers, is a uniquely Indian civilizational achievement, arguably one of its, for me, inarguably, by the way, one of its crown jewels, and contrary to the ideologues and the enemies who both seek to connect Urdu to its supposed and entirely mythical origins in Arabia and Persia. So, so this business about optional histories, there is an optional history of the time before. There's also another history in which, for the creation of something that is exclusively Indian, you reach back to a different past. This is, in fact, the product of whole millennia of hybridization in this subcontinental crucible. It has been fed by more cultural streams than can ever be identified, and is one of the prime symbols of that deep culture of diversity and heterogeneity, which is paradoxically the essence, and to my mind, the only possible essence of Indian civilization. Because, of course, and despite the impatient frustration of the purist ideologues, desperately searching for some Bharati or some Indic, I think the Dick is crucial, searching for some Indic essence, the paradoxical essence of this civilization is that it has no essence, which should be a familiar thought from those of us who read about existentialism. It is. To search for an essence for it misses the point. The paradoxical essence of this civilization is that it has no essence other than this plural, multifarious diversity, this deep and promiscuous hybridity. Thank you.
बहुत शुक्रिया आलोक के यादगारी खुतबा है, तो सवाल जवाब नहीं लेते। अशोक जी 2-4 जुमले कहेंगे, फिर मैं बाकायदा शुक्रिया अदा करूँगा।
दोस्तों, आपने इतनी लंबी तकरीर सुनी है और उसमें इतने मुद्दे उठाए गए कि उन सब के बारे में मैं कुछ नहीं कहूँगा। आपको 2-4 किस्से सुनाऊंगा ताकि माहौल थोड़ा हल्का हो जाए। मैं अभी उज्जैन गया था, तो वहाँ, अब उज्जैन जो है वो वैसे तो तीर्थ है, लेकिन अब वो होटल का शहर हो गया। मतलब आप जाते हैं तो एक के साथ होटल क्लब। जो उज्जैन मैं जानता था, जहाँ मैं 50 बार गया होऊंगा जब मध्य प्रदेश में था, वो गायब है। तो वहाँ एक साहब ने बताया कि साहब, एक दिन महाकाल की सवारी निकलती है जो कहलाती है शाही सवारी। इस बार वो शाही शब्द हटा दिया और कहा राजकीय सवारी। तो मैं जो भाषण दे रहा था उसमें मैंने कहा सवारी भी तो उर्दू है। तो एक तो ये, दूसरा ये कि बहुत बरसों पहले कालिदास समारोह वहाँ होता है, उसका मैं करता धरता होता था, तो उसकी एक बैठक चल रही थी और कलेक्टर मेरे बगल में बैठा हुआ था। तो यकायक उसने कहा कि सर मुझे 2 मिनट माफ़ कीजिएगा, मुझे एक ज़रूरी फाइल निपटानी है। हाँ निपटा लो। अब चूँकि बगल में बैठा था तो मैंने ऊपर देखा 2 पीपे घी की स्वीकृति। तो जब वो उसने दस्तखत कर दी, वो चला गया। मैंने कहा मियाँ, ये कलेक्ट्रेट को 2 पीपे घी की क्या ज़रूरत है? उसने कहा सही, ये नज़ारत में हमारे यहाँ घी है, हम रखते हैं पीपे। हमने कहा नज़ारत में क्यों रखते हो? कहा कि साहब यहाँ जो दिया जलता है उज्जैन में, वो दिए का घी कलेक्ट्रेट से जाता है। तो मेरा सेकुलर जो दिमाग था वो चकराया। मैंने कहा भाई कलेक्ट्रेट से क्यों जाता है? उनका साहब ये सनद है यहाँ। किसकी सनद है? औरंगजेब की सनद। औरंगजेब की सनद। मुझे याद है कि आकाशवाणी, जब ऑल इंडिया रेडियो का नाम आकाशवाणी हुआ, तो जो खबरें आती थीं, तो जो हिंदी में खबरें होती थी, जो उर्दू की खबरें होती थी, वो कहते थे वजीर आजम ने मजीद कहा, अभी आगे कहा नहीं। तो एक तरह की जो आपने जिसका जिक्र भी किया कि इधर भी शुद्धता थी, उधर भी शुद्धता थी। और हम लोग जब 57-58 में, जो कि आज़ादी के कोई 10-12 साल ही हुए थे, तो गालिब का दीवान पहली बार नागरी में, देवनागरी में छप के आया। तो हम लोग पढ़ते थे। नामवर सिंह उन दिनों वहीं थे 1 साल के लिए। तो सुबह की सैर में ये शर्त होती थी कि बारी बारी से आप एक गालिब का कोई असाधारण शेर ढूंढ के लाएंगे। तो गालिब की तो ये हालत है ना कि जिन गानों की, जिन गज़लों को गाया गया है, उसमें जो असली शेर है वही नहीं गाया गया है। मसलन दिले नादा तुझे हुआ क्या है, उसमें असली शेर तो ये है, लालो गुल कहाँ से आते हैं, अब क्या चीज़ है, हवा क्या है। तो हम लोग खोज खोज के, तो उसी ज़माने में हमने ए परतवे खुर्शीदे जहाँ ताब इधर भी, साये की तरह हम पे अजब वक्त पड़ा। जौहरे तेग बसर चश्मे दीगर मालूम, हूँ मैं वो सब्ज़ा कि ज़हराब उगाता है मुझे। तो ये ऐसे खोज खोज के लाते थे। तो तब तक ये नहीं हुआ था। आज़ादी के 10-12 बरस बाद भी हम लोगों के जो साधारण लोग थे, साधारण लोग पढ़ रहे थे। बाद में क्या हुआ, हमने हिंदी पाठ्य पुस्तकें, जो हिंदी प्राइमर्स चलते हैं 7वीं 8वीं 9वीं क्लास में, उनमें देशभक्ति के बहुत पाठ थे। मैंने एक बार गिने कि 6वीं क्लास में 17 पाठ देशभक्ति के थे। तो मैंने वो जो पाठ्य पुस्तक बनाते थे, हमारे मित्र थे, हमने कहा यार क्या बकवास है, ये बच्चे ये पढ़ेंगे। तो उन्होंने कहा ऐसा करते हैं, हम एक मीटिंग बुलाते हैं, तुम इसमें बताओ कि क्या गड़बड़ है। कहा ठीक। लोग आए तो मैंने शुरुआत की कि भाई आजकल आपको मालूम है कि बच्चे जो हैं वे बिल्कुल देशभक्ति से बिल्कुल खाली हैं। अरे बोले हाँ साहब, बिल्कुल ही देशभक्ति का तो नाम ही कोई किसी के पास। हमने कहा ये 6वीं क्लास में 17 पाठ हैं देशभक्ति, और फिर भी देशभक्ति नहीं है बच्चों में। बहरहाल किस्सा होता ये कि हमने नई पाठ्य पुस्तकें बनाई और हमने ये निर्देश दिया कि हर पाठ्य पुस्तक में, हर क्लास में एक पाठ उर्दू का होगा। तो 3 पाठ ऐसे हुए। एक जाकिर हुसैन साहब की वो अब्बू खां की बकरी, और एक क्या क्या नाच दिखाती हैं रोटियां नज़ीर अकबर आबादी की, और एक फ़िक्र तौसवी का कोई एक मज़ाहिया था। और फिर तय हुआ कि पहले इन पाठ्य पुस्तकों को आजमाया जाए। तो ट्रायल के तौर पर 400 स्कूल चुने गए जो बस्तर से लेकर इंदौर तक थे। तो शहराती स्कूल, देहाती स्कूल वगैरह वगैरह। अब इनकी शिक्षकों की प्रतिक्रियाएं आई इन पाठ्य पुस्तकों के बारे में। तो उसमें कहा गया कि अब्बू खां की बकरी बेकार है, क्योंकि इससे कोई सबक नहीं मिलता। तो मतलब एक होता है ना सवाल जी पाठ के अंत में, क्या सबक,
क्या सीख मिलती
तो वो
है?
सबक नहीं मिलता। दूसरा, नज़ीर अकबराबादी की कविता जो है वो बहुत भौतिकवादी है और रोटियों के बारे में है। बच्चों को तो सितारों के बारे में पता नहीं चाहिए, रोटी रोटी क्या होता है। और तीसरा, फिक्र तौसवी का कहा कि बच्चे इसको समझ नहीं पाएंगे। पर दिलचस्प बात यह है कि एक प्रतिक्रिया ये भी थी कि महादेवी वर्मा का जो पाठ है उसमें भारतीय संस्कृति के तत्वों का अभाव है। यहाँ अब मुझे इतना गुस्सा आया, मैंने एक लंबा 10 पेज का, तो कृष्ण कुमार भी उस एक्सरसाइज में शामिल थे उस समय, मध्य प्रदेश में। मैंने एक नोट वोट लिखा कि क्या बकवास है इस तरह की, ये शिक्षकों की ये हालत है। तो भाषा के क्षेत्र में हिंदी और उर्दू, संभवतः हिंदी के अध्यापकों ने बहुत ही निंदनीय भूमिका निभाई है। आप किसी भी स्कूल में अगर जाएं तो वहाँ जो सबसे जिस अध्यापक को बच्चे नापसंद करते हैं वो हिंदी मैडम, क्योंकि इन अध्यापकों ने हिंदी की जो अपनी इंद्रियता है उसमें है, ऐसा नहीं है जो नहीं है, उसी टीके है उसको बिल्कुल ध्वस्त करके उसको उपदेश की भाषा बना दिया। हिंदी अध्यापकों ने एक अपना ये कर्तव्य मान लिया है कि वो छात्रों की नैतिकता का स्तर ऊंचा उठाएंगे। इसलिए ये अकारण नहीं है कि आज जब शिक्षा की स्वतंत्रता और स्वायत्तता पर रोजीना हमला हो रहा है तो शिक्षा के क्षेत्र से बोलने वाले शिक्षक होंगे 50 लाख देश में।
बोलता एक नहीं,
इतने तो होंगे, सब मिलाइए,
बिल्कुल
50 लाख शिक्षक हैं और उनमें से 1% भी इसका विरोध नहीं कर रहा, क्योंकि इनमें से और 90,000 स्कूल बंद हुए हैं, 90,000 स्कूल बंद हुए हैं, जिनमें से ज्यादातर मध्य प्रदेश और राजस्थान में। तो ये एक बहुत ही जो पैठ है, मतलब जो असल घुसपैठिए तो ये है, पर ये घुसपैठियों को हमने आमंत्रित किया। तो बहरहाल ये दूसरा, आप सब ये सब सुनने थोड़ी बैठे हैं। आप
ये रहा मुझे कि अशोक जी ने अशोक जी ने नामवर जी और अपने आप को सादा आदमी गिना, जो बहुत ही कमाल की बात है मेरे ख्याल में। ऐसी सादगी हमारे देश को ज़रूरत है, ऐसी सादगी हम सबको अता हो। बहुत शुक्रिया आप सब लोगों का। 2 बातें बस मैं हिंदी हैबिटेट सेंटर का और आज के यहाँ प्रोग्रामिंग डिवीज़न का डायरेक्टर सुरेश साहब का, नरेश का, शादाब का, विद्युन का, तमाम लोगों का शुक्रिया अदा करना चाहता हूँ हमें ये मौका देने के लिए, और ये मौका हमें लगातार देते रहें। अगले साल जब हम ये लेक्चर करेंगे तो फ़ारूक़ी साहब की 2 किताबें दोबारा इशाअत में आएंगी इंशाअल्लाह। एक जो उनकी किताब थी अर्ली उर्दू लिटरेचर एंड हिस्ट्री एंड कल्चर एंड हिस्ट्री, जो बहुत दिनों से आउट ऑफ प्रिंट थी, OUP से पहले छपी थी, वो पेंगुइन छापेगा इस साल, तो इस अगले साल हम उसका यहाँ पे रस्म इजरा भी करेंगे। और दास्तान अमीर हमज़ा पर जो उनकी 6 जिल्दों में जो किताब है, उसकी जो पहली जिल्द है ख़ास तौर से, जिसमें बहुत सारे थ्योरेटिकल डिस्कशंस हैं, बहुत सारे नज़रियाती बहसें हैं, साहिरी शाही साहिब क़िरानी दास्तान अमीर हमज़ा का मुताला, उसकी जिल्द अव्वल को भी हिंदी में हम लोग इस साल लाएंगे। और वो दोनों किताबें अगले साल उनके, इस साल जब लेक्चर होगा आपको यहीं रहना होगा तो उसमें हम शाया करेंगे। आप सबका बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया, फिर से इंडिया हैबिटेट सेंटर का बहुत शुक्रिया, आप तमाम लोगों को बुलाने के लिए।